Hello, Facebook. Hello, YouTube. I am going to share my music and start letting everybody in from the waiting room. All right, here we go. There we go. Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Greatest Generation Live program here on Thursday, August 8th. I am Todd DePastino, and this is the Veterans Breakfast Club. And we have Glenn Flickinger, who is our host for these programs. And, we've been getting together now, what, Glenn, well over a year, right?
Getting together in what sense? You mean,
well, on these Thursday nights to talk about all things World War II.
Well, I've been hosting this program since 2020, Todd. But at first it was on a monthly basis. And then in the last 7-8 months, it's been on a weekly basis, with the exception of a couple of weeks here and there.
And I think that's what I think that's what I meant is we've been getting together every Thursday night for some time now, for many, many months now. And, we usually have experts come on and talk, give presentations, answer questions. Veterans, of course, have joined us and shared stories. And Glenn and I thought it would be wonderful to do an open conversation about World War II. We have a lot of experts kind of who gather, we've learned every week, and a lot of information to share, topics of interest to discuss, questions that could be asked, including questions we have, Glenn. So we thought we'd just do an open conversation tonight about all things World War II. You bring the topic, you bring the subject, you bring the question, the episode that you want to share or talk about, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever you would like to bring up. And feel free to bring anything up with respect to World War II, any aspect of it. It's the thing I've loved about World War II studies is, you can study the guys in the trenches, so to speak, in the foxholes, on the Navy ships, the paratroopers, etc. You can study the upper command, the supreme commanders, the field commanders. You can study the politics of it. You can study the social aspects of World War II. It really is sort of a never-ending story, if you will. So whatever aspect of it someone would like to jump into, we welcome it.
What I always would tell my students, why are we taking a course on World War II that, something that happened, 1,000 years ago to a 20-year-old student? I would say, well, it's the largest single event in human history, involving more people in more places across the globe than any other. And it's arguably the deadliest event in human history. And those two facts itself warrant very intensive lifelong study.
And I think you can argue that we still live in the shadow of World War II.
Correct.
I'll start this off with this comment and see if anybody would like to follow up on it. I was down on this vacation recently. I mentioned to people last week, and one of my friends down there is another really genuine historian, and I made the statement to him, and at first he didn't agree, and then after a while he changed his mind. I said, 500 years from now, when historians are studying this period, they're not going to call it World War I and World War II. It's sort of like the 100 Years' War between the French and the British. It was really 127 years, and it was really 6 or 7 wars. They were just more or less all about the same thing, the same theme, different characters, different, slightly different technologies from start to finish. And I've always thought that if I could come back 500 years from now as Todd DePastino and write a history of the first half of the 20th century, I would call it maybe the Great War.
Or the 30 Years' War. 1914 to 1945.
Anybody else agree with that or disagree with that? Scott, you're a teacher. You should have a thought on that, Scott Masters.
Nothing like putting somebody on the spot here.
As long as they're Canadian.
No, I actually call it the 30 Years' War all the time in class. I mean, I've seen that term quite a bit in some of the recent reading that I've done, and it totally makes sense, and it's a great little way to get the kids to remember it.
Yeah. And to understand, a great way also to understand the connections between World War I and World War II. I mean, not to, sound like an idiot about it, but World War II was the sequel. It truly was part two of a global war.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
And you can make the argument that there was virtually no stoppage of fighting in some part of the world between those two. Right? There was the Civil War in Russia, and really the Japanese got started with the Chinese in 1931.
Yep.
Maybe there was a few years there in the late 20s where there wasn't any significant conflict, but that was about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was almost as if, to use an analogy, it was like halftime of a football game, or two boxers going into their corners. I mean, it was, resting up for the part two. Brad Washabaugh.
I always wondered just how, was it a perfect storm that Hitler, Mussolini, all the leaders that came together? Was it a perfect storm? But if they weren't there, was there somebody else to replace them? Was the culture, was the environment primed to have somebody, regardless whether the name was Hitler or Mussolini or whomever, come to power and get in these conflicts?
I'm just going to jump in, Glenn. I'm sorry, just because I'm so used to teaching younger people. I'm going to try and translate Brad's astute, interesting question and dumb it down for everybody, and kind of say, there's some young people who have raised the moral question, the baby Hitler question. Do we kill baby Hitler in the crib? If we had a chance to take a time machine, go back, do we kill Adolf Hitler before he could do so much damage? And my answer to that would be another would have arisen. Would have been different name, different movement, but the social forces, the political forces, the economic forces, the psychological forces, maybe spiritual forces, were so powerful that I think it was going to get expressed. They were going to get expressed in some way.
That is my belief as well. It may have been expressed in a slightly different way had it not been Hitler, had it been some other German, more than likely. But the Japanese were not exactly innocent during this time frame. So what would have happened to the Japanese empire, designs on empire, had there been someone other than Hitler? The other question that comes along the same way, and I'd be interested in everybody's opinion, but especially our esteemed professor, what about depression? No depression, no World War II, or different World War II?
A very different World War II, I would say. Absolutely. Yeah, Great Depression. It was one of the results of World War I, and absolutely helped to put the world on the path to World War II. And the other thing I would like to say is, I would, and maybe you disagree with this, I always taught students that World War II was actually just two wars that went on at the same time.
Yeah.
And the two major wars, these were major wars, the two major combatants in these wars were Germany and the Soviet Union on the one hand, and Japan and China on the other hand. And all of the rest of the world had to decide, which side do we support?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Todd, if you're asking me that. And anybody else have a thought on that? I have a little different way to express that. So the other way I've thought about it, Todd, similar, is, when I've not taught too many young people on World War II, mine are mostly adult audiences, is that, think about it. Who were our allies in World War II? Great Britain, yeah, only a recent ally of ours. It had, the generation of generals in World War II, Marshall, Patton, the other very senior generals, were very anti-British for a reason. They were students of born in the 1880s and 1890s. You know, they still remember people who were alive for the War of 1812, right? The other, of course, great ally of ours becomes the Soviet Union, right? And it's like getting in bed with the devil. We sort of had to do it. Winston Churchill made the famous quote, was it, where's my Churchillians here? Give me that quote on Churchill made on Hitler. Um, even if I was in league with the devil, I'd give him a nice comment or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You know, so you know, it really was an unusual war in that sense, right? And even, you know, our alliance with China, you know, China and Soviet Union were our two great allies that within years after the war become our great enemies within 3 years.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Yeah, very odd. And then you wonder, and again, please feel free to raise your hand or here we go, Ray. You wonder, and I'll just finish this thought. If Hitler had stopped with the conquest of France and the Low Countries, what would have happened? What would have happened? I don't think there would have been what we call World War II. That would have been it. It would have ended in 1940, maybe 1941.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the Japanese would still have tried to take advantage even of that development, Hitler taking over mainland Europe, right? Somebody has their hand up. Let's see. Get
Ray
somebody.
Brendel.
Hey, hi. My question is, the Treaty of Versailles was so hard on Germany. Had that treaty not had been so hard on them, would there have been a World War II? And did that have anything to do with the Depression?
Yes. No and yes. That's my answer. Quick answer. Treaty of Versailles. Scott, I'd be interested. Glenn, I'd be interested to hear, or anybody else, what they have to say. I always thought of the Treaty of Versailles as kind of the anti-Goldilocks. It was exactly wrong. If it had been harsher on Germany, there would have been no World War II. If it had been easier on Germany, there might not have been World War II. But the fact that it was just exactly where it shouldn't have been, harsh enough to leave Germany seething with anger and resentment and grievance towards the Western powers, the Allied powers, mired in desperate poverty, but also allowing Germany, a united Germany, to continue to exist. It wasn't extinguished as a country. Germany was young in 1914. It was 40 years old. And one of the thoughts was extinguish the country, split it apart back into its component kingdom so that it could never rise again.
Or the other part of it, and this plays into the decision in World War II, is if we hadn't accepted an armistice, instead, had we carried the war through to an unconditional surrender, which would have then been the extinguishment. And within Germany, and I am not really deeply read in German history, but enough to say this, within Germany, it was the Prussian element, the Prussian culture that drove the militarism that was involved, right? And it drove the society, it drove the culture. They were the ones that felt the sting of the end of World War I in the Versailles Treaty. And it was the Prussian attitude, culture, militarism that drove the German military to do the things they did. If you go back to Bismarck and the unification of Germany, I think you can, if you want to talk about the origins of World War II, I think you can take them all the way back to Bismarck. Now we're getting too deep in the weeds. Okay.
Scott, how do you teach the Versailles Treaty?
I think very much in the way you talked about. I think one of the big issues certainly was the fact that it was overly harsh. It created an unbelievably angry Germany. It was a perfect scenario for somebody like Hitler to manipulate and to take advantage of. I think to your point about what you said, had it been stronger and firmer, and had there been some sort of real enforcement ability as far as the League of Nations is concerned, maybe there would have been a different outcome. But that was just such a divided organization as it was. So I basically look at it as a treaty that really catalyzed the war. Like, it really pushed everything in that direction. I think it was going to happen anyway, but it definitely created the firestorm.
And it definitely gave the Germans something to focus on, like a focus of their grievances that made it kind of inevitable that Germany would be hostile to the Allied powers after the war.
Well, it gave Hitler and his kind that line, the famous line that they took advantage of, and that's that they were stabbed in the back at the end of World War I. That we'd have won that one. We'd have won World War I, but at the very end, the civilians took over and gave up.
Right.
Right, which was absolutely not true. The other element that I've always thought about, there were significant high level military officials in the French and the American army who wanted to continue the war. They wanted to go through to unconditional surrender. Pershing being one.
Pershing, for sure.
And on the French side, I'll murder the name Foch or Foch being the other. And I'm sure there were others too. Patton, of course. I mean, that was his lifelong desire. But there was thought on the military side about, wait a second, why are we giving up? We can run over these guys right now with almost no problem and take all of Germany and change it forever.
Ben Wright.
Well, at the end of World War I, of course, was the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire as well. And I'm curious as to what your thoughts are about how much that affected World War II coming along because of the dispersal of those powers afterwards. And we wound up in several of those areas in World War II.
Yes, we did. So the Ottoman Empire you mentioned, and what was the other empire?
Austria, the Habsburgs.
Austria-Hungary. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it certainly fractionalized Europe, right? I forget the number of new countries all of a sudden showed up on the map, right? Via the Versailles Treaty. And it certainly played a role. I don't think I'm deeply enough, thought about that deeply enough to give you a good answer, except one point I would make. During the process of the negotiation of the Versailles Treaty, the Austrians petitioned to become part of Germany. And they were turned down because the French and the British were concerned that with Austria attached to Germany, it would become too powerful again. So, just an interesting fact. Todd, do you want to contribute more to Ben's question? Because I don't have anything else.
I have very little. I mean, World War I destroyed 4 empires: the Russian, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman. And those empires kind of had kept a lot of the nationalist, feelings under wraps. They had provided a sort of order to the world. And so, you topple 4 empires, and then you couple that with revolution that really struck from the French border all the way to the Sea of Japan. You have a scene of unbelievable chaos and turmoil that the world order needed to be reshaped. We needed a new world order. There had been a world order before World War I. World War I destroyed it, but didn't solve the problem, didn't reorder it. World War II is what reordered it, I would say. Greg Yost, man, we want you to chime in here very soon. But Ray Brendel?
Well, I have a different question, but I'll just say that, am I correct? The British Empire is the only one that survived World War I, correct? I just find that kind of interesting. But my question is another what if. When America entered World War I, it was pretty much a draw, a stalemate.
Mm-hmm.
So what if America had not entered, what kind of outcome would we have had?
Great, great question. Great question. I think the stalemate would have continued. Scott Masters, the Canadian, might disagree. Bob Flage?
Yes, sir. My what question is, at the Versailles Treaty, all those sanctions were placed on Germany, but from what I understand, they were not enforced. Did they ever discuss or plan on how they would enforce what they told Germany could do or not do? My understanding is they learned how to fly and develop pilots by a youth glider club or something that got in the back door that nobody realized. Hey, they're training pilots now. So my question is, did they discuss how they were going to enforce it, and what if they did? What would have happened?
Glenn, I don't know if you want to answer, but I'll just hop in and say they discussed it and they never came to a resolution, how to enforce it. You're absolutely right. The Versailles Treaty was not enforced.
Well, that aspect of it was not. The reparations were enforced, which is what turned helped to contribute to the economic depression that came about, right? Because all that money that the Germans owed, where'd they get the money from? A lot of it was borrowed from American banks. And when the American banks called those loans in the late 20s and early 30s, the Germans couldn't pay them. And that was one of the elements that contributed to the Great Depression. Do I have it right?
Well, yeah, you do have it right, but Germany quit paying what in 1923? They quit paying, and I think they then started repaying, but then Hitler canceled all payments. They were always behind in their payments, always behind, constantly behind, had to borrow, and it was a circular lending system so that they were borrowing money to pay the Allies, and and the Allies were borrowing money from the US, and yeah, it was Dave Seaver.
So I'll address the empire thing real quick, because the British Empire mainly survived. The French still had an empire. They were in North Africa and Southeast Asia. The Dutch were in the Indies. So there were still some European tentacles around the globe.
Right.
But back to, the Versailles Treaty, Germany, we got a raw deal out of that. And along comes this young guy named Adolf with a funny mustache. And he's like, come on, you guys, we're Germans. We're better than those guys. National socialism, that sense of national German pride. He did a lot of stuff under the table. I mean, he was disguising factories as schools and things like that to build his war machine. And, Europe, for the most part, looked the other way because they were still so sick of war from World War I that they just let it go. And then, Chamberlain goes over there and it's like, hey, dude, we really don't need this. We had a bad time in the last one. And, remember, peace in our time, for however long that lasted, at least 2 minutes. So, that I think that plays into it as well, is the rest of Europe just really wasn't willing to put their foot down and say, we're not going to do this again. Just because, World War I just left that bad taste in their mouth, and all the reparations from that, that everybody owed everybody. So.
And 100% right. There's another element to it with Britain. Yes, the British Empire survived, but it was crumbling without them really maybe being able to see it, right? I mean, you don't lose 1 million men killed and not have some impact on your empire.
Sure.
That was one element. And you're absolutely right. I think the British, especially the British, were just so exhausted from World War I that until Churchill came along and changed their minds after the Munich Pact, they were just too exhausted to move on it.
Right. And what was America's attitude? Isolationism.
Yes.
We're just going to shut ourselves off from the rest of the world and live on our happy little continent over here and let them do whatever they're going to do.
Yeah.
Brad Washabaugh.
Well, I just wanted to maybe take it down a few levels and talk about the greatest generation. I see Ed Cottrell out there.
Yes.
But, Todd, you interviewed countless World War II veterans. I'm a baby boomer. I grew up, with friends whose dads fought in World War II. And, to us, the war wasn't talked about much. It was neat when our friends would come out with a helmet or a tent or a sleeping bag or some type of surplus equipment from World War II. But we really never heard much from the veterans who formed the greatest generation. You've talked to so many of them. And this whole thing, the complex geopolitical arena that was happening, the average person probably didn't grasp much of this, but they were asked to go to war. And maybe we can talk, and maybe Ed can talk about what he was seeing and feeling at that time, and your observation from the greatest generation of veterans that actually went forth into war to fight.
That's a wonderful question. I think we should have Ed talk about what he thought. I mean, he was a young, a teenager, a high school student, college student when the war was starting. Did you follow the war closely, Ed?
To be honest, really not very much. Only in my history class, and I was more interested in other things. And as I think most all the young people were at that time, I think what was happening over the world was beyond the realm of the small towns and cities and like that, and people depended upon the radio for information, and you didn't know who was giving you what information. So I really wasn't that much involved in listening until all of a sudden Pearl Harbor came, and then everybody got interested.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, because the world is on flames by 1941. The world is in flames, and everybody around the world is taking sides and has been drawn into the war, except Americans, except people in the United States who do have that privilege where you could, ignore the news if you want and go on with your life until Pearl Harbor.
And someone mentioned the isolationist movement, which we've talked about a few times in the different programs. And that was an incredibly, incredibly strong movement. And it was countrywide. It was deep. It was very difficult for FDR to maneuver around that politically, but he did. And even in the face of all that, he was able to prepare the country for war much better than it was prepared for World War I. There's a great story, here that is Pittsburgh based. Todd, I'm sure you know it, out at Soldiers and Sailors Hall on December 7th, 1941.
The America First Committee.
America First Committee had a big meeting there. I can't remember who was on stage. It wasn't Lindbergh, but it was one of the other big name officials, right? And the audience, there was a big audience in the hall. And it was all about isolationism and not getting into the war. The guy is speaking. Somebody walks out in the middle of his speech, hands him a little note. And the note obviously said, the Japanese just bombed Pearl Harbor. And that was pretty much the end of the America First Committee.
Yeah. Gerald Nye was the speaker. He was a senator from North Dakota.
North Dakota, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And he was at the Nye Committee. He was a well-known isolationist speaking in Pittsburgh. Bob von Bargen, people may notice that your last name is German. Your parents were German. You're old enough to remember World War II. I think your parents were young people in World War I. What did they tell you about, Germany in the World War I to World War II period?
My mother came from East Prussia. My father came from where the Elbe River empties into the North Sea. They both emigrated here after the First World War. My father had to go to sea when he was 14 years old as a cabin boy because they couldn't feed him because they were starving. My mother would tell stories about how the pride of the Prussian people, as you mentioned earlier, how they felt deceived that the Kaiser had run off to Belgium after the war. The effects of the inflation of 1923. My grandfather was East Prussia was a region, a horse region, and he was I guess if you put it in Texas terms, he was a rancher. He raised horses, and he was he was put out of business. My mother said that he would go to sell a horse, and he would leave on 3 horses, one that he rode on, the second one to sell, and the third one to carry the big bundles of paper money. And then once he had it, he had to sell it and get rid of it right away. I'm sure you've all seen these pictures. I had some here. I just gave them to my son of a bill or a postage stamp of 5 million marks. And so as a result, they came to this country, and to get away from that, and they did fairly well. And unfortunately, my interesting story is that my mother won some money in the Irish sweepstakes in 1934, and they went back to Germany. And by that time, as you know, Hitler came in, and he was supposedly the good guy. He was the guy that Hindenburg chose rather than the communists. And Hitler was a gifted speaker. But Hitler had these the brown shirts, where within a year he basically controlled everything. And if you said anything that was wrong, you got yourself in trouble. Well, my mother got herself in trouble. While visiting relatives in 1934, she spoke her mind. What was happening with the Jewish merchants, and how the Jews were being treated. And she had a great story I'll never forget. She said they were in a hotel in Berlin, and early on a Sunday morning, when there was a knock on the door. And she opened up the door, and she said, never been so frightened in her whole life. That there was an SS trooper standing there, SS officer. And he basically said to her, Mrs. von Bargen, we understand you're not too happy with the Third Reich. We suggest that there is a ship leaving from Bremerhaven on Tuesday morning. We suggest that you be on it, otherwise you will not be enjoying your vacation as much as you have in the past. And they went and immediately left Berlin, went to Bremerhaven, stayed in the hotel, had never left the hotel, went right to the ship, came to the United States, and my mother was a super patriot, and it affected my life and my attitude and my military experience. And if I ever wanted to get her angry, all I'd have to do is, when I go in the house, if I would whistle, da 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 da, die Fahne hoch, and so I'd hear this voice, who makes that melody in my house? But basically, that was it. That there was this feeling of being betrayed, and they were just easily taken over. But whether they wanted to or not, by the end of 1934, the Nazis had that iron grip, and if you said anything wrong, you disappeared. So and needless to say, when I was born on July 4th, 1935. I think I have something to do with the ship. Yes, but, my mother named me Robert after my uncle, Frederick after my father, and George after George Washington.
Isn't that amazing? The super patriots. You were raised by real American patriots who were immigrants who appreciated what our country stood for.
Oh, yes.
And that inspired your service in the Air Force.
Yeah. 36 years worth.
Jeez, how amazing. You mentioned that, but I want to go to here. I want to hold on a second. I want to show something. You mentioned that German hyperinflation. Here's a great statistic. In 1921, this loaf of bread cost 163 marks. The following year, it was 1.5 million marks. In 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. That's hyperinflation. I mean, so much so that here's a woman shoving marks into a furnace because it was worth more as fuel than it was as money. Here are marks being weighed. People would pay by the weight of the marks instead of the count. Here's kids, they had made a kite out of marks. Here's a woman who made a dress out of marks. So that's that kind of hyperinflation. It was also, that was a strategy to evade the reparations.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Bob Flage, you were going to say something.
Yeah, when there was a mention a little bit a while ago about being prepared for the war, our Civil Conservation Corps really organized a lot of men that, in the military fashion. So they had some, background of taking orders and marching and all that kind of thing. My grandfather was an assistant and then a camp commander out in the northwest rather. And he said that's really one of the things that really, saved our butts in a way.
George Marshall, the famous general, ran a CCC camp in the early 1930s.
Amazing.
A lot of military involved in it. Yeah. Maybe we should, unless there's someone else to comment, maybe we should make the point. Here we are, August the 8th. We're right at the same time frame as the end of the war in the Pacific, the VJ Day. Yeah. August the 7th, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, August the 9th on Nagasaki. Perhaps we ought to at least recognize that, or at least think about that, talk about that. Greg Yost, you have your hand up.
I wanted to offer some opinions on some of the comments that have been made. In terms of the war getting started, and definitely, we'll get to the war's end here, but I believe the only aspect of World War II that was inevitable from the 19-teens was the Asian side of it. Japan was on the ascendancy because it was copying all sorts of European techniques in terms of social organization and industrialization. China was on the decline. Japan was starting the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So I think that aspect of World War II was inevitable. In the European side, I don't think World War II was inevitable immediately following World War I. Although John Maynard Keynes' famous book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, says this is not a peace, this is an armistice that will only last 20 years. And he was off by 6 or 8 weeks or whatever. I still think, though, that absent the Depression, I don't think there would have been a war. And absent Hitler, I don't think the Germans would have organized. There's too many arguments there to make, but oh boy, I'll sort of be very brief. Every country that was created in Eastern Europe after Versailles was created as a democracy. And by 1939, the only democracy that was remaining was Czechoslovakia, which Britain and France gave away. But those countries weren't ready for democracy. There was a psychoanalyst who predicted, and psychoanalysts are into families and fathers and all sorts of stuff. There's a psychoanalyst who predicted that the Germans would simply elect a dictator. And they did that twice. Following the hyperinflation and everything, they put in the great benevolent dictator, the grandfather figure, Hindenburg, who sort of stabilized things. And only when and Hitler was Hitler had his famous book and sort of fired everyone up. But he was semi-marginal figure by the late 20s. Only when the Depression came along did I think the fringe elements, the Nazis and the communists on the right and the left. And of course, Hindenburg appoints Hitler chancellor to combat the communists, right? And Hitler just basically takes over. However, Hitler was not popular among the upper crust of the Germans. They didn't like this sort of rabble-rousing guy. In fact, when he took over, one of the first things he was sort of expected to do was get rid of the brown shirts. If you remember, he assassinated the brown shirts in Night of the Long Knives, including his right-hand man, basically, the 1A of the Nazi movement, Ernest Röhm. So if you go through the 30s, Hitler was still sort of trying to consolidate his power. As late as the Munich conference, when Hitler kept making demand after demand after demand and getting away with it, there's evidence now that the generals were convinced that Munich was going to be a failure, and that when he came back from Munich and this whole thing blew up in his face, they were actually going to plot a coup. And of course, Hitler walks out of Munich with Czechoslovakia in hand. The Czechs were not invited to the Munich conference, as we know. I don't think the war was inevitable until 1938 in Europe. Asia, a different story. So let me just weigh in on that, and now we can end the war after we get it started. Sorry.
No, thank you, Greg. Thank you. Do we want to jump over to the end of the war in the Pacific, or is there more discussion along
Dave Seaver has his hand up.
So yeah, I put it up when we turn to the Pacific. So just a couple of comments and a quick story is what has always amazed me about the war in the Pacific is, the Pacific Ocean is enormous. And we had troops everywhere from the Aleutian Islands to New Guinea, 3 different thrusts across the Pacific, northern, central, south. And the logistics that it took to fight that war, because everything had to be produced, it had to be put on ships, it had to get there. It just boggles my mind how we were able to do that. I don't know. It's been disputed. It was somebody credited Yamamoto with saying after Pearl Harbor, we awakened a sleeping giant. And I know that's been debated, but literally that's what happened. This country woke, we were isolationist, but when you get punched in the mouth, it's hard to ignore. And, we responded. The other one, quick story. So when I first started working at Shadyside Hospital years ago, I had the privilege of taking care of some of our greatest generation. And one gentleman who was from Pittsburgh told me his story. He was at Tulane University when the war broke out. So he, like everybody else, he went in the Marine Corps and became a Marine Raider. And, they were disbanded in 1943. So he gave me some stories about, going on raids, surface in the submarine, your little rubber boat, you row into the island, bury it, etc. But the most interesting part of his story is he fast forwarded to 1945, and he is now on Tinian Island. And he said, he was an officer because he had college education. And he said his superiors came to him and said, pick a platoon of men. You can have anybody you want. We have a special assignment for you. So he picked his men and they pointed him to a building and said, guard that building. Nobody unauthorized gets in there. Guess what he was guarding? And he had no idea.
Yeah.
The atom bomb.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of our local Pittsburghers. He's since passed on. I actually ran into a nephew of his here a couple of months ago and recognized the same last name. So we had a little conversation about that. And he had no idea that his uncle had done that during World War II.
Oh, neat. What a neat story.
I'll shut up now.
Nick DeVoe, I just want to say hi. I haven't seen you in a long time. Good to see you.
Oh, Nick.
Hi, Todd. How are you doing?
St. Lucia survived the tropical depression storm.
Oh, that's old news.
Okay.
We got our first gold medal. That's the big story.
That's right. My daughter told me that. My daughter said to tell Nick that St. Lucia got his first. Congratulations.
And a silver. Everybody is walking around like in a dream. It's been amazing. But so yeah, it's surreal. It really has been surreal.
Oh, how great.
Yeah. But just wanted to throw in here with the conversation tonight. Well, the last contributor just talked about the atom bomb. So I was fortunate enough to get over to Japan in 2022 and meet with Mr. Mori, who survived the atom bomb of Hiroshima. And this is a man and his wife who still live on the hills above Hiroshima. I was honored enough to go to his house and have an audience with him. And in addition to, through a translator, but one of the things I did not really ever consider and appreciate was the fallout of the length of time that the radioactivity continued to contaminate and kill people. It's a legacy that I just, in all my World War II research, I just never really thought about it until I went there. But sitting in this man's home, one of the most amazing things that struck me is he said, and I wish I had my diary here because I made notes, but he said, even he found, like, he was very careful with his words, and he said one of the things that he really wanted people to understand was his exact words of what they went through and what they experienced. And he said that he found that even the guides down at the Hiroshima Memorial Museum, which is an amazing place, but he said that even he found that they were using certain words where the nuance wasn't quite right. And I just thought, my God, here is a guy who survived the atom bomb, and in his present time, he's telling me that the story is already beginning to deviate. Maybe is a strong word, but it was so amazing to me. Like, we talk about World War II, which was 80 years ago, and we're so separated from that. But so I just wonder, like, over time, how will these stories continue to get, as we get further and further away from it, how will they continue to be, I guess, distorted, for want of a better word? So anyway, that was just something I wanted to share with us tonight. Just amazing.
And congratulations to Julian Alfred, who won the gold medal in the 100 meters from St. Lucia, the first St. Lucia gold medal in Olympic history.
Yep. It's surreal. It just is surreal. It really is.
How terrific. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Nick.
Thanks, great.
Rick Weber.
Yes, thank you, Todd. I am not a historian scholar. I'm not anywhere near Scott. You and certainly the best looking commentator in person, and he knows who that is. But he mentioned George C. Marshall. Last year I read the book. It was over 1,500 pages for something like that. 1939, Roosevelt appointed him as the general of the army. At that time, the United States Army was not even in the top 10 of the world. The Navy wasn't in the top 10. By 1943, they were supplying all the Allies with everything. So from 1939 to 1943, 4 years, because of General Marshall, we were able to supply the world, not just with troops, but all the other equipment that they needed. And if you ever want to read a terrific book, it took me forever, but the name of the book is George C. Marshall, Defender of the Democracy. And the only thing I can tell you is from reading the book, he was offered and was told that he would be in charge of the D-Day landing over Eisenhower. And he talked to a couple of his friends and they said, no, you cannot do that. You are the only general in the Army that General MacArthur will listen to. He had the respect of every officer in the United States Army. Obviously became Secretary of State, and it goes on. But one of the reasons the United States was significant in the war was because they weren't prepared. 1939, 1940, we didn't really engage until later on. So that's all I wanted to say. I mean, I'm certainly not an astute scholar of war, but being an infantry guy, you can't go to war for a long time. It takes a lot of time. And that's where the problem is. You're in a 5-year war, 10-year war, people get worn out. And that's why the wars don't last that long.
Rick, do you mind if I jump in? Thank you so
Certainly.
much.
That's
I
all I
want to
wanted
ask
to
you,
say.
I want to ask,
Yeah.
no, I want to ask you a question. I put a link to the book here in the chat. George Marshall, Defender of the Republic.
Oh, Republic. I'm sorry. Yeah, but
Yeah.
it was best war book I've ever read, because he was tremendous, and he's from Pennsylvania, Uniontown.
That's right. Rick, you said that war wears people down, wears people, and it does. I think history has shown it really, people tire. Often wars end because the two sides are exhausted. Do you
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you now, I'm shifting now to your era, the Vietnam War. You served, and immediately made me think you served in Vietnam in the year 1971.
70.
77. Okay, 1970. Did you
in one? Yeah, I was in Cambodia in 70.
Did you get the sense that the U.S. had been worn down?
Oh, by 1970, the morale in the United States Army was at the lowest it ever. And this is fact. General Abrams said he had to get the Army out of Vietnam because it was the worst disciplined army in the history of the United States Army, and that's pretty much factual. They had no respect for leadership, because they had no idea what they were doing and why they were there. There was no.
Right.
I mean, we had no game plan.
No faith.
It's not like World War II or World War I, or that's my take. I'm not a scholar. I'm not that smart.
Can I ask you another question, Rick? And again, this is deeply personal. You are a veteran of the 101st Airborne Division, Vietnam. You are a company commander, in essence. And you're also an enormous admirer of the greatest generation, the World War II generation. Enormous admirer. And also a student of World War II. Why? Do you get it? Are you in a sense envious of that generation that had a cause that was not questioned like yours was, had a war that was, the lines were clearer?
First of all, my dad was a World War II veteran. He joined the Navy in 1940. Never talked about it. As a matter of fact, I learned more about my dad's time in the Navy from one person, Todd DePastino, when I gave him his logbook. My dad never talked about the war, but he was in it for over 5 years. Yes, meeting these guys. You have a gentleman on there tonight. He'll be 103 in January.
Yeah.
Ed Cottrell. You have to, when you meet these guys and what they were through and what they mean and the respect that they have for other people. I mean, yesterday was a great day for me. I spent time with two of my best World War II friends. I have more World War II friends. Yes, they're the greatest. They are the greatest generation. They respect, they're humble. You never hear them say, I did this, I did that.
You don't.
And I'm going to do this. One of the greatest pictures, and I sent it to your friend, Mr. Henry, today. My favorite picture that I just got from D-Day was a picture of 9 paratroopers on an airplane, June 6, 1944, and then 80 years later, the same 9 guys are on the plane.
Right.
That to me is unbelievable. So yeah, they are the greatest generation. They'll never talk about another generation like them. So I salute all those guys. They are the greatest.
I'd like to just come back to George Marshall, who is one of my most favorite military figures of any time, right? I really believe we don't appreciate all that he accomplished in World War II, and even after World War II, after all, the Marshall Plan, named after him. I read a book not too long ago, a couple of 3 years ago, about George Marshall and his role in China after World War II, which I knew very little about, even though I've read many of the same biographies, right? And, he retired as chief of staff of the U.S. Army. He wanted to go home and rest. He was tired, deserved a rest. And the scene is he's outside of his home in Leesburg, up in the tree, cutting down some branches because he wanted to clean up the tree. And his wife comes out and says, "Harry's calling." It was Harry Truman, of course. And Harry sent him to China to try to reach a compromise between the communists and Chiang Kai-shek. And he spent a lot of time in China trying to do that, came close a couple of times, but ultimately was not successful, obviously. But it was incredible how well respected he was there by both sides on the Chinese Civil War, and how close he came to brokering some sort of agreement. And maybe it was just pie in the sky and it was never going to happen, but it was his charisma, his authority, his persona, which even gave it a chance of happening. Last point on George C. Marshall. If you ever get to VMI, go to the George Marshall Museum. It's there. I've been there. And when I was there, I promised them that if I win the lottery one day, I'm going to give them $50 million to fix it up, because it's a little threadbare. It's kind of come on hard times, but I haven't won the lottery yet.
Rick mentioned yesterday being with his two friends, Guy Prestia and Warren Goss. Here is Rick Weber at our breakfast in Beaver County yesterday. We had Guy Prestia, who's 102, 511 days in the 45th Infantry Division, 511 days in combat with the 45th Infantry Division, I should say. Served in North Africa, Sicily, southern Italy, southern France, Germany, part of the liberation of Dachau. You have Warren Goss right here, 99 years old. He landed on D-Day on Utah Beach, June 6, 1944, and fought through to the end of the war. And yesterday, I got to meet and see in person Henry Shepke, our young 16-year-old member of the Veterans Breakfast Club, who's been joining us online for 4 years now. He's from Madison, Wisconsin. He and his twin brother and his father all traveled to Pittsburgh to see a baseball game. And I got to have lunch with him, and then he came to our breakfast yesterday. And it was so wonderful to have Henry Shepke kind of like being like a celebrity, because there were a lot of people at the breakfast who knew him and wanted their pictures with him. And it was so much fun to kind of, share that morning with him.
Hey, Todd.
Yeah.
I did not send him my picture. I sent him the two heroes. I did not. They asked me to sit with them, but I didn't give them my picture.
Okay. You should have.
So the picture, no. He wanted World War II heroes. He wanted heroes. I'm not in that company, sir. That's
Carol Popchalk. How are you?
I'm fine. While we're on the subject of George Marshall, who happens to be one of my favorites as well, I've run across an interesting little factoid about him that I wasn't expecting. I'm working on some research because I was foolish enough to ask Glenn a question, and he said, "Why don't you do some homework?" So I'm doing some research for a future show on POW camps in the United States, and I found a George C. Marshall story that actually has a Julia Parsons connection.
Oh,
I know Julia isn't with us this evening, but I hope we can pass this on to her in some form. The question that I had raised to Glenn was, were American POW camps better at following the Geneva Conventions and treatment of prisoners than the prisoner of war camps that were in the war zones in the Pacific and in the European theater of war? This was triggered by the excellent program that was done on the POWs who were at Buchenwald. And I've begun research and found some interesting information, which as I said, we'll get around to later on a future program. But here's the George C. Marshall connection. The only time that I have been able to find so far that the Geneva Conventions were not adhered to was when the U-boat mariners were captured and brought stateside and dispersed among the various camps. They pretty much were interrogated at only 2 locations, one near DC and the other one in Pennsylvania. And George C. Marshall made the decision to not adhere to one of the Geneva Conventions about letting prisoners notify their families that they were captured.
Yep.
And you can guess now where the reason that he did this. He did not want the work of the Navy and Army code breakers to be compromised by letting the families know when these guys had been captured. So they were segregated for much longer periods of time, and they were segregated in the prison camps from other prisoners so that other prisoners didn't know they were there either, in order to protect the Navy and Army code breakers.
Wow. Keeping
That was
Enigma
a
secret.
decision by George C. Marshall. It had his stamp of approval.
That is so interesting, Carol. I'd never heard that story before.
Well, actually, Todd, we had the author of that book on U515. Is it U515 or 505?
505.
505. We had that author of the book on just a couple of months ago, right? That's the submarine that is in Chicago at a museum there. And in the book, he goes through that. Now, he doesn't talk about George Marshall, as I recall. But that's a great point that in the book, he does cover the fact that we broke the Geneva Convention in order to keep it a secret. And those sailors, U-boat sailors, were kept in a prison in Louisiana, separate from all other prisoners until just before the end of the war.
John Stooley, you had I think you were waving your hand in front of the camera, were you?
Yes, I was.
There we go. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. Say thank you again for a great program. Say hello to everybody and hello to Glenn. I have 2 simple questions. Number 1, how many civilians and military in total were killed during the war? And what was the final cost worldwide of World War II? Any idea?
Both, it's surprising how little idea we really have.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah. Can you hear us now, John?
John?
No? Rick, can you hear us?
I hear you fine. I have
Okay.
no clue. You can't answer that question. You're smart, but you're not that smart. Guaranteed.
And it's stunning. I mean, the dollar amount, the cost of the war. Yeah, no, I have no idea. But the lives lost, that is something that I have spent some time looking up. And you get figures from all over, and Greg Yost will chime in, I hope. You will read everything from 50 million to 125 million people killed. And then you get into debates about, well, Stalin killed 20 million of those. Do you count that as, casualties of World War II? Maybe not, even if you take those off the table. How many Chinese died? It's very hard. There weren't a lot of records being kept in a lot of places where people were dying, left and right. But it was an enormous number of people. And in absolute terms, probably the most of any war or illness in human history.
In absolute terms, more than the Black Death or the bubonic plague, I suppose. In absolute in numbers, because there just weren't that many people.
Correct. Yeah, correct. But
the population.
The Black Death is really, really, really close to World War II in absolute terms, and of course is enormously. The Black Death is number 1 in proportional terms.
Yeah. There's a great book called The Blood Lens, which I won't remember the author unless I look it up.
Timothy Snyder?
Yeah, sounds right. Anyway, it's about World War I and World War II, sort of the bloodlands being between Berlin and Moscow, and how many people, how terrible it was. Again, talk about the 2 wars being seen as one, almost a continuous war there for 30 years. And I think it's been a long time, but I think he estimated 25, 30 million civilians killed in that time frame between those two capitals. Just civilians who got in the way of the war.
Yeah. So we shouldn't be too surprised that there's hostility there today.
No.
Right.
No. Yes, someone, Steve Corbett is his hand over there.
Steve. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see. There we go. Sorry about that, Steve. Let's see. Can you unmute, Steve? There we nope. Huh.
There we go.
There we go. All right.
Too many buttons.
Good.
Couple of comments. This book, Crusade in Europe by Dwight Eisenhower, it has an intimate detail of the planning before we even went to Europe, getting the American industry and the people into the mindset of planning for World War II. It actually takes Eisenhower from when he was in the Philippines before he came back to the States and ultimately ended up in Europe. Very detailed, a great book. I couldn't put it down once I got started. Second thing I want to talk about, my father couldn't go in the war because of some limitations, but all of his brothers did. 5 brothers in the Army, 1 in the Navy. And they browbeat him to death. But the one uncle was still living 6, 7 years ago, and I got to visit with him. Because before that, we never inquired of what our uncles did in the war. And like someone said, they bring out a memento or a helmet or something, and we were all intrigued with that, but nobody visited with them about it.
Right.
So anyway, I sat down with him for 2 days, and he joined the National Guard Army in Northeast Kansas. He went to Alabama, to California, to Washington State, to Arkansas, I think, New York City, on troop trains, multiple day trips on these troop trains and training and preparation. Finally boards a ship in New York City, 17 days across the North Atlantic in a troop ship, which, we've probably all been on a cruise or two and very smooth and very comfortable, but however many thousand troops are on the troop ship, can't even imagine. So one of my next questions was, how did they feed these people on a ship? He said, well, you got to eat twice a day. If you ate at 2 and 1400, that was your 2 times, or 6 and 6, whatever your 12-hour number was, you went to chow. So the next question is, what do they feed you? You got a boiled potato, and you got a bowl or a cup of some kind of stew or gruel or something, and coffee. He said, if you didn't drink coffee when you went on that ship, you drank coffee thereafter. So then he was in Europe for a while. He was in one of the landings on the beach for a day. He never walked in more than 18 inches of water when he made a landings. So then I asked him, so when you finally went in from the shoreline, what happened? He said, well, they gave you 2, we would call them granola bars today. They were 2 4-section wafers wrapped in probably some kind of cosmoline or something. And that was breakfast, lunch, and dinner and a snack. And those 4 squares and the canteens of water provided them with all the nutrition, the calories they needed for that day. If they didn't have a chow line set up after 2 days, they brought you more wafers. And then we went on through these other activities during the war. But listening to him talk about the training and the troop trains and my Air Force career, learning about hurry up and wait was nothing.
Hurry up on those troop ships. You would snake through a line for hours, then get your meal, eat it, and then pretty soon get in the line for dinner. I mean, that's how long the lines were. It was you spent most of your time in line waiting to be fed.
But after that conversation, I was so disappointed. I didn't inquire of my other uncles, some of their activities and their places they were at, both in Europe and in the Pacific.
Steve, exactly.
And
I think all of us here have those regrets that we never had those conversations.
My uncle in the Navy, 2 of his Army brothers met up with him in Japan at the end of the war, and they were giving him a hard time being in the Navy. And he said, well, come with me. And he took them on board the ship and wormed his way down into the area where the bunk was at and pointed out his rack. And the other 2 brothers like, so what? His comment was, do you see any mud? No mud on that rack.
That's right.
So that was my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Wonderful to have you a part of us. And I'm just going to say that, we have a whole magazine devoted to the World War II, to the air war in Europe. If you're watching on Facebook or on YouTube and you don't get this magazine, let me know. We're happy to send one to you in the mail free of charge. This is a major part of the outreach that we do. We now send it out to about 10,000 households. And we send also Bob Flage. I just sent 25 to Bob today so that he could distribute it to people in Jacksonville, Florida. Let us know if you want a copy. This is that's Steve's holding it up. You can email me at todd@veteransbreakfastclub.org. We want to thank Tobacco Free Adagio Health for sponsoring this conversation. They help people quit smoking and they educate people about the hazards of tobacco use. And they also advocate for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can find out more about Tobacco Free Adagio Health at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. UPMC for Life is a major sponsor of ours. We're very grateful to them for supporting what we do. They have a Medicare Advantage plan for veterans written by veterans, and you can find out more about the plans that they offer at upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. All right.
So where else we want to go here, Todd? Any I'm gonna give somebody mention, or our last speaker just mentioned Eisenhower, his book Crusade in Europe. This is a book I picked up, went to the Barnes and Noble to get a different book. It was, musing around and saw this. I'm a big Eisenhower fan, like a George C. Marshall fan.
Glenn, you do not need another book on Dwight Eisenhower.
Well, you do. And at first I thought, nah, I can't read another book on Ike because this is unique. This is an excellent writer, and I hadn't heard of him before, Michael Paradis, although I've heard of this book, which I didn't read. He wrote a book called The Last Mission to Tokyo before this. So it's not a biography. It's the story of Dwight Eisenhower in D-Day from just before he's picked. Rick, that story is in here, just before he's picked to lead the D-Day invasion by Roosevelt over Marshall, because Roosevelt, couldn't live without Marshall in D.C., right? And it goes through right up to June the 7th, basically, or June just after D-Day. And what's unique about it is each chapter is based on a different character who wrote a memoir or wrote something about Eisenhower. Kay Summersby has a chapter. Charles Portal, who was the head of the RAF, has a chapter. There's like 40 some chapters, each one a small chapter from their perspective about Eisenhower and the development of Eisenhower from, an okay kind of general at first in North Africa to becoming the supreme commander and becoming the Eisenhower, of legend. So if you like Eisenhower, even though you might have read 10 other biographies of Eisenhower, this one is unique. They talk about how he came to name his biography Crusade in Europe. There's a lot in here about that, which he took actually from Churchill.
I put the link to the book here in the Zoom chat. Greg Yost, I think you're exactly right. We have 16 minutes left in our conversation, and it's about time we talked about the end of World War II. 79th anniversary coming up next week, VJ Day, which is marked here in the United States on August 14th.
Wow, don't know. I mean, I don't know if that was a pitch to me, but what to add? I mean, this Titanic struggle, it came to an end. So many things were resolved. Some things were left unresolved, and new problems were created. Certainly, the advent of nuclear weapons at the very end of the war, I think, has affected us. Is still affecting us to this day. I should probably leave it there and put that out for discussion. But yeah, so much left unresolved even after the most titanic struggle in all of human history.
Here's Times Square, August 14th, 1945. I think anybody who is alive then remembers that day. My father-in-law, who was born in 1942, his earliest memory is VJ Day. His earliest memory was VJ Day. He remembers that vividly. Let me ask you, if Ed Cottrell is still on with us? Ed, do you remember VJ Day?
I did. I was just getting ready to go down to San Antonio to be discharged because I remember VJ Day, and when I got to San Antonio, all the guys from the 48th Fighter Group who were on their way to Japan turned around and came back, and they met me in San Antonio, and they were one grade higher in rank because they got promoted on the ship over. And that's how I remember VJ Day. If I'd have gone on to Japan, I would have got promoted too. I remember VJ Day very, very definitely.
Very vividly. Huh.
I have a follow-up question for Ed along the same lines. You remember VJ Day, you must remember the first time you heard about the atomic bomb being dropped. A couple of weeks before.
I was in awe when I heard about the atomic bomb.
But can you remember, what did that mean to you? What when they used the phrase atomic bomb?
I had no idea what an atomic bomb was. Had no idea. All I knew was I saw the pictures of it and the devastation that it did. That's all I knew about atomic bomb. I'm not very intelligent about that type of.
Well, most people weren't. I mean, it's pretty high level physics.
Yeah, I had no idea there was such a thing as an atomic bomb. Although I had heard rumors that they were testing some type of a bomb out in the desert in Arizona, and it was off limits, very much off limits to everybody except specific people assigned to that program.
How much relief did you and your fellow, your colleagues in the military at that time, those around you, how much relief did you feel when it became clear that the droppings of the 2 atomic bombs would end the war?
I don't know whether it was relief or the knowledge that all the killings that were going to go on suddenly might come to a stop, and the countries would come to their sense, and I don't know. It's hard to explain exactly what you felt at that time. I just know that I was happy that the wars were over and we could continue on back to life.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Ed. So what else, Todd? Any other comments on the end of the war? Any other?
Yeah, the end of the war, and I'll just say, Bob Von Bargen, I'll say the end of the war is quite complicated. And I know Greg Yost is holding his tongue because if we even get into the discussion of how Japan surrendered, we're talking another hour here because or more, because it's really a complicated story. It's not as straightforward as simply the bomb was dropped, the Japanese surrendered. There was a lot that had to happen within Japan for that surrender to be effected. And there were quite a few in the Japanese military who did not want to surrender. And they didn't care how many bombs were dropped. They were going to fight to the bitter end with, bamboo and rocks. I mean, it really took an extraordinary effort on the part of the emperor to effect the surrender. Bob.
Interesting thing. I was 10 years old when the war ended. And I was a kid growing up in New York City. And in the summertime, I was fortunate enough to be, my neighbor would invite me up to near Bangor, New York. It was up near Poughkeepsie. And I remember that day very, very well as a 10-year-old. At that time, out in, what shall we say, the country, or up the country, as we said in New York City, most people didn't, there were no television sets, of course.
No.
And many people didn't even have a radio. And so we heard on the radio that the war had ended. And the man who owned the house, our neighbor in our apartment house in New York, Mr. Michaud, he had a 1930 Ford. It was a converted truck. It had a bay in the back. And we got into this 1931 Ford Model A. The Michaud people and the people who were in this summer resort, and we got standing up in the back of the truck. We drove down the street, out in the countryside, down the driveways of these houses, sometimes right across the lawn, with him blowing the horn, ooga, ooga, and we're screaming and yelling, the war is over, the war is over. And we drove all around. And I'll never forget, as a kid, 10 years old, the last house on the street was Mr. Martin. In the First World War, he had been gassed. And he was ill. He was probably in his about 50 years old, 45, 50 years old. And he was standing on the porch as we drove up, and he looked kind of confused as this crazy people coming up, blowing the horn, yelling and screaming. And then I could see in his eyes, he recognized what we were saying. And he stood there on the porch and tears poured down his eyes. And as a 10-year-old, I stood there and I thought, wow, the war's over. The killing and the maiming is coming to an end. And I had an internal change at that moment, recognizing what that meant, that the war was over. It was really an interesting moment.
Thank you for sharing that.
Pretty powerful.
Very powerful.
We got 7 more minutes. I have a controversial question.
Okay.
What would have happened had the Russians not been involved at the end of the war? Was it necessary for the Russians to be involved to end the war in the Pacific?
Huge question. That's a huge part. That's a huge historical debate.
Because it has a lot of repercussions, and we got 7 minutes, so we could figure it out.
Yeah, we'll easily figure it out. Oh yeah. And just
we can solve this in 7 minutes. I don't think there's any question.
And just for review, the war came to an end over the course of 4 days, essentially. That it was 4 momentous days. The first was the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, August 6th. The second, and this is the one that the Americans forgot about during the Cold War, the second was that the Soviet Union declared war against Japan and invaded Manchuria, effectively stopping the Japanese Imperial Army, the most powerful part of the Japanese Imperial Army, which was in Manchuria, China.
The largest part of the Imperial Army, still 1 million plus men.
And then on the 9th, the following day, the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. So the debate is, which of these 3 events had the biggest impact? And from what I understand, my limited reading on the subject is it had different events had a different impact on different people within the Japanese army, the Japanese Navy, and the Japanese government. It is almost sure that the emperor himself was very much shaken by the bombs. The bombs had an impact on the emperor's thinking. But everybody was terrified of the Soviet Union invading Japan. They did not want that.
Yeah, there was a famous battle in Manchuria in 1937, I'm going to say, 1937, 38, where the Russians and the Japanese met, and the Russians were victorious easily. It really pounded the Japanese. So I think the Japanese always had this innate fear of the Russian military.
Mm-hmm.
And the Japanese were happy that Hitler did his thing and the Russian military turned the other direction during the war.
Marshal Zhukov, ironically, was the Russian commander during that battle against the Japanese in 37, 38, when that was. It was sort of his first claim to fame, that the Japanese thought they had this border dispute that they were just going to easily resolve, and then the Russians under Zhukov sort of came in and let them know who was really boss. So,
yeah. There's also the story at the end of the war about the emperor makes a recording, right? The emperor's voice had never
Yes.
been heard. Emperor's voice had never been heard in public, never been heard on the radio. He makes a recording to be there we go, all right, to be broadcast. I can't remember exactly who, but sources within the Japanese army, the most radical forces, find out about this, and they actually invade the imperial palace looking for this record in order to stop it from being played, but they're not successful. And in fact, it was played. There was actually a somewhat of a palace coup, if you will, to try to stop this recording from playing, which it then in fact was played the next day.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, it was the imperial army. Factions of the imperial army invaded, just like you said, the palace, tried to find this record because they heard that the emperor had recorded his voice, and Japanese had never heard his voice before, announcing the surrender of Japan, and that this record was going to go to a radio station in Tokyo and was going to be broadcast. So they tried to find the record to break it, and it was smuggled out in laundry, and it was played the next day, just like you said. It became known in Japanese as the dual voice broadcast. Officially, it's the imperial rescript on the termination of the war. And it was the first time the Japanese had ever heard the emperor's voice. And the emperor speaks in kind of meandering, indirect terms about, he says, after pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. And in other words, he was trying to say we're surrendering, but he couldn't quite say we're surrendering. But he was going to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration.
The interplay, there's I can't remember again the name. I'm sorry about my memory tonight. I've had 3 very busy days. But there's a biography, the most recent biography on Hirohito from 15 years or so ago. I think I've read it twice. I still don't know that I could explain the intricacies of the politics within the Japanese government relative to Hirohito and his cabinet and the military and so forth. To me, it's like trying to read ancient Greek backwards.
Exactly. So opaque.
Yeah.
So opaque, and so much of it is unspoken assumptions.
Yeah.
Let me say a few things about that broadcast. One is that when it was played, the emperor was, of course, so completely isolated from the Japanese people in his upbringing and everything. He was viewed as a god. He spoke in such an arcane and abstract and highfalutin Japanese dialect that basically no one who heard that really even understood what he was saying.
Right.
So that someone had to come onto the broadcast after that recording was played and basically translate what he had just said. That's how far he was removed. Of course, one of the things that the Allies agreed to after the war was that the emperor could keep his position. He would no longer be a god, but he would keep his position. And then there would be the Allied military government, which, according to the European tradition, every freed European nation had a 4-power government installed, including in the Eastern European, where the British and the French and the US had a say technically in Warsaw or Bucharest or wherever. And the Russians even had one in Brussels. Now, obviously, the Iron Curtain split the East and the West, and the US say in the Warsaw government was basically zero. Well, the Soviets had sort of expected that they were going to have a say in the Tokyo government after the war, and the US basically said no, and they put MacArthur in, whose role of Japan, probably but for the Korean War, his guidance of Japan after the war probably would have won him a Nobel Peace Prize in the same way that Marshall won for the Marshall Plan. His guidance of Japan after the war was absolutely spectacular. And like I say, but for the Korean War and all his bellicose discussions there, he probably would have won a Nobel Peace Prize for his rule of Japan, 45 to 51.
I'm no big fan of MacArthur, but I have to say that the high point in his career was those 5 or 6 years in overseeing the transition of Japan, for sure.
You were 1 minute over, but George, we would love to hear from you. You get the last word.
Oh, thanks a lot, Todd. It's good to see all of you. I had read, concerning the emperor and trying to get that tape out. The war was still going on. There had already been 2 atomic bombs drops, and we're still launching all sorts of raids. And I read that a normal bombing raid was heading towards Tokyo to go to northern Japan, and the lights went out in Tokyo, and that really stymied the coup, because everybody was looking for this tape and all they had was flashlights, and that's how they were able to smuggle it out.
Oh, that's interesting.
No
Great.
lights, because this bomber group is heading over to some oil tank field in northern Japan, and everybody probably thought that another bomb was being dropped,
Was going to be
this time
dropped.
on Tokyo.
I've read the same thing, George. Read this. I think that's the book this fellow wrote called The Last Mission to Tokyo, which was the last B-29 mission that took place on August the 14th.
Yeah, B-29s, right.
Hey, Bob von Bargen, you just emailed me. We can't have an end to this without a sincere thank you to Glenn. Glenn, thank you so much for bringing us together and presiding over this conversation and sharing some of your expertise. This is really cool to have these kind of free-flowing discussions.
Well, thank you, but Todd, you're the master at orchestrating these discussions. You just have a touch that is difficult to duplicate. But no, it's always fun to talk World War II. Anytime everybody wants to talk, give me a call.
It is fun. Hey, when you don't golf, what else are you going to do? All right. Thank you, guys. Take care. Good night, everybody.